Let's start with a really cheesy joke that I probably already ruined for you, but why did the web developer drown? He didn't know whether to float right or float left. Oh, now we're all awake. There, hits you later. So I'm Sarah Federman. I'm a designer, developer, hybrid, whatever, depends on the day. I work on the Spectrum design system at Adobe. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what that actually is, but thanks again. So what is a design system? You might have heard a lot about design systems. There's, it's so hot right now, and everybody's talking about them, but, nobody really knows what they are because there's so many things. But essentially, a design system is a collection of products that help you solve the problem of scaling your design practice. And this usually includes things like a UI component library, design files. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but it's basically a vehicle for getting your design out there in a lot of places for a lot of people. And the benefits include being able to quickly iterate on products, so you can create prototypes quicker, you don't have to worry about the details, and stronger brand awareness. So everybody knows what a Facebook button looks like, right? So it helps everybody know where they are and where they're going. And everybody can speak the same language, so your designers are talking to your developers and they're all talking about the same thing. We label our comps correctly, et cetera, et cetera. And it empowers developers to get stuff done, which we love. You can make design decisions without the direct input of a designer a lot of times because you just have the guidelines and you know where you're going. And again, it improves user experience. So consistent design is a good thing. It means that your users are familiar with your processes and they know what a Adobe product looks like and how to interact with that. Hopefully, we'll get there. And quick note on scale. When I'm talking about scale here, I don't mean like DevOpsy things like QPS and serving a gajillion users at a time and such. I'm talking about scale as in being able to apply one thing to many contexts. So getting the best results with the least duplication of effort and keeping your design dry, essentially. So we're solving duplication of things like asset and UI creation, your sketch files, your XD files, all the mocks that your designers create, your code creation, so your React library or your CSS, all the things that go into making a front end. Your accessibility work, this is super, super huge. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this, but with a design system, your accessibility is a single point of success or failure, and you really, really, really need to get that right. Because if a button has a bad contrast ratio one place, it has it everywhere, and nobody wants that. But if you get it great, it's good. So we also take care of things like user testing, some unit testing, things like that, and a bunch of other stuff that you no longer have to worry about because it's my job now. But the other reason we don't want to have duplication, besides it being, just extra work, it's that it leads to fragmentation. And fragmentation means we stop sharing things. So we have one-off changes and, more code and more confusing UX because a user might be doing something and it's just a little bit different this time, but it was the same elsewhere. I mean, you might have seen this with some keyboard shortcuts. And it's harder to onboard new developers and new designers, and the code is different in different parts of the code base. They can't switch on to different products easily. So we make it so you don't have to worry about this stuff. And things get out of date. Adopting new versions is hard. And when there's more to keep track of, more things get left undone. It seems like common sense, right? But there are stories all the time of, like 200 shades of blue on GitHub and Facebook, and it happens. It blows up, believe me. So design systems to the rescue. There's a really cute elephant. He's so cute. This is what we do. I'm the elephant in the room. We take care of the details so you can do the hard stuff. And by the hard stuff, I mean like actually doing your feature development, your road mapping, figuring out what the real problems are that your design is solving. So we give you all the tools that you can use to do your job, and then you kind of just go from there. So we give you UI components often, design files, code repos, documentation. That's huge. Don't ever forget that part. And then this just makes your life easier. So here's a bit of an example of what might actually go into a design system. So at the lower end, and this applies to all companies of all shapes and sizes, you have things like buttons, links, inputs, fonts, colors, all of your small indivisible pieces, and your documentation on how to use those. Then you go up into your UI components. You might have an overarching grid for all of your products, code style guidelines, developer tooling, design tokens, and design tokens, we'll get into this a little bit later, but essentially they're making your design values into variables, and that's consumed by other applications. So I know that Spectrum Blue 200 is, hash whatever, and that once I change that, it'll propagate everywhere. And products have a palette of values to choose from. So, and then you get into more, comprehensive stuff like high-level guidelines, motion guidelines, voice and tone is huge. We're building up a content strategy team, so that's awesome. And workflow tooling, that's an area of design systems that's really kind of thrashing right now. There's a lot of really great work happening, but we're not quite there yet. Airbnb has a really awesome tool called React SketchUp you may have heard of that solves a little bit of problems around workflow where keeping things up to date and duplication of effort. And there's the stuff that makes it all work, design ops. So some people believe that this is the part of the system itself, but I tend to think of it as essential things to the system, but not the system itself. So like your sprint planning is essential to your product, but it's not the product itself. So recently there's been a lot of thought put into what design ops are, and I recommend you check out Kalig's article on the subject. And I think that tooling and process of design systems falls under that umbrella. And if you're wondering more about this, I wrote an article called Distilling How We Think About Design Systems, so I'm not going to dive into this a lot. You can imagine that the return on some of this dry effort diminishes as the number of people and number of products decreases, so different design systems include different things. We're not all solving the same problems. But, we're talking about scale today, so let's assume that we need the whole shebang, because Adobe does at least. So let's talk about Adobe. Our design system is called Spectrum. Here's our logo, and here's our unofficial logo. That's my manager, Gavin, who's really mad that I put this in my slides, but whatever. It's courtesy of our content strategist, Andy. It's the first week he came in, he posted this, it was great. And our problem space. So we have over 200 designers in our design org, over 124 products being sent to market. So this is fully branded products. It doesn't include things like beta and utilities, so it's probably more around like 170. They tend to forget that, and I'm like, that's 3 companies, what are you talking about? So we have 6 platforms, UWP, Windows, Mac OS, web desktop, iOS, Android, and mobile web. And it's a really large product space, or problem space, so things can get a little complex. We have 3 frameworks. Those are CSS, React, and Native. And does anybody want to take a guess at how many buttons we have in our system? Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good guess. You got me. So button, pretty simple, right? It's a bunch of text on a background. It does a thing when you click it, probably has a hover or focus state. This has 1,080 permutations, and those are the official ones. So we have all of our different variations, our call to action button, our primary button, secondary warning for destroying stuff, and one that goes on background colors. And then we have the standard and quiet styles for each of those. So quiet is a little bit less intrusive into your UI, and it's pretty useful as well. 5 states. So we have the default hover, press, focus, and disabled states. And we have 4 different color themes. So you may have noticed in Adobe products like Photoshop, there's always a setting for the color theme, and it changes everything in the UI. So we have a lot of stuff. And then, kabam, all of our platforms. And there are subtle differences between these, like we make the buttons bigger for touch and stuff like that. But yeah, it's a lot of work. Multiply that by a useful amount of UI components and you get a lot of work. But fortunately, we have an amazing team. We have around 12 people working on this full-time now, and trust me, it's never enough, but it's another matter. We'll get there. And our team structure is a subgroups, so we have designers, hybrids, that's me, hi, engineers, and a project manager, and a senior design manager, and a new design manager. But, you know, we all tend to cross over. I'm more on the engineering side some days, and some days I'm on the design side. But, and hopefully we'll get a PM soon. But this may or may not work for you based on your org size, but it's been good for us so far. And our team is under this umbrella of Spectrum Design. So we actually don't ship the actual code. We ship some supporting code, and we contribute to the code bases. But we ship to these teams that maintain their own libraries. There's a little bit of history behind this, but we used to have a lot more frameworks, which has made it even harder. We used to have like Spectrum View, an internal version of React, Spectrum Torque, and Coral UI. So let's talk about the history for a little bit. You can understand the problem space a little more. So originally, there were 2 different standards, and I'd say this is a pretty common thing when design systems develop organically. Some of the times, 2 of them develop simultaneously, and often one is a bunch of developers trying to promote code reuse, and then there's designers who want reusable mocks. So that's what happened with us. And it actually happened in different little silos as well. There was one in the Experience Cloud and one in the Creative Cloud. So things got a little weird. Coral wasn't actually framework agnostic. It was meant to be, but it didn't actually end up that way. So we had multiple implementations, and things got a little bit fragmented. So surprise, we get a top-down verdict. Now Spectrum eats everybody. We are Coral, and we started contributing to Coral. This is actually before I joined, so I'm not super clear on all the details, but that's what I hear. And the last couple of years, we've kind of been forming the team and figuring out what we're doing. This is a bit of trivia from my small group communication in college that I never actually went to, but you know. So we swallowed up some Coral, we started contributing, and we had a bunch of frameworks that we were contributing to, mostly because React had all of its licensing issues, and the legal department decided universally to avoid it. React Spectrum we had evolved out of a company that we had acquired, and it had its own code base, and we had kind of thought we were going to migrate away from it, and it was going to go in favor of Torque, our internal framework, but surprise, React changed its license. Now it's just normal MIT. And we got one of the biggest engineering mandates in Adobe history. So all new products had to be made using React, and teams should think about migrating. The Torque team was wound down, and they made a migration tool. So 2017 to 2018, we've started to get our processes in order. We're really we've released our design system, our new site, and we're just kind of scaling. We've gotten some of that down, but it's really about scale this year, so it's super exciting. Then let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of Spectrum itself. Let's talk about what we've done now that we've gotten here. Cool. So Spectrum consists of what's called DNA and some tooling. And it's also design and content. The Spectrum site, you may think of it as a style guide, and precursors, which we'll get into later. DNA is super, super important. It's our source of truth for design data, and it's consumed by all frameworks and all tools. It contains variables for things like colors and sizing, and the important thing here, if we change a value, it should propagate everywhere, which means if things are using it correctly, everyone stays up to date, and we shouldn't break things because it'll break everything, but that's separate. And it's just basically a bunch of JSON, or it was at least. It was originally 2 repos. DNA was the umbrella of Spectrum Origin and Balthazar. Origins was a bunch of JSON, and it had a bunch of strange syntax that was used to do variables substitution and compile to different targets. It worked for a while, but it turned out that we didn't actually need to compile to a bunch of different targets, and our weird syntax for JSON meant that we had very specific coupling with Balthazar, so Balthazar had to know about the JSON structure to compile it, which isn't really a great situation. It doesn't scale. So JSON became standard JavaScript. We're doing all sorts of templating, inclusion, just basic looping and stuff, so it's much easier. And we're going from there now. And this is what the engineering part of our org works on. They also work on in-app tools and an asset delivery pipeline. In-app tools is something that's on the horizon. We're making it so that designers have access to actual Spectrum elements within XD. And it's a little bit weird right now because XD is actually developing their extension platform while we build this. So we're actually underneath the hood, and we have we're making, I think, C++, and it's 20-minute compile times. And so hopefully things will get better, and XD will have an extension platform with JavaScript hooks and stuff. So that'll be cool. And our design and contents. So I think we have 4 designers on this now, 3 or 4. They work on designing things for our style guide. Sticker sheets they support products that are implementing our stuff, and they do the UI design and the content guidelines for them. They work, and we all work, under these principles: rational, human, and reductive. So rational just means, it makes sense. Everything is done for a reason. We are testing things. We are doing the work so you can be confident that, this is a good decision. Human, at the core of it, every product is made and used by a human, and that means that we need to have amazing accessibility, be inclusive of everybody, and just stop, we don't need to force our system on people, we just need to work with them and solve their real problems. And then reductive, that essentially just means no more design than is necessary. We're gonna keep things simple and only solve the real problems that we have. So broken down, our design system comes into guidelines, styles, elements, and patterns. Our guidelines are things like our app frame, accessibility, stuff like that. Our styles are things like our colors, sizing, fonts, etc. And our elements are our actual UI components, things like our drop-down, our button, all the little bits that make up what are known as patterns, which we're still developing on, but this is a big combination of elements used to just do a task. So a bunch of inputs might make a form, things like that. And we talked a little bit earlier about this, but when you have 1,080 buttons or ridiculous amounts of drop-downs, creating and maintaining the sticker sheets is no fun. So one of our designers decided to build a little bit of a prototype, and what they did is they started coding SVGs, and those SVGs were made into sticker sheets. So one SVG file or one SVG code can be looped over, and we get 1,080 buttons just by changing the color and moving things a little bit to the right and down. So all of our stuff is generated now, which means we don't have to worry about that. And that actually hooks into DNA, so all of the variables are fed into that directly, which is really awesome, and it saves us a bunch of time. So the hybrid subgroup works on what is known as the Spectrum website. It's built with handlebars templates, and the content is currently JSON. It's going to get delivered by CMS soon, hopefully Netlify. And right now, our designers make edits to the content using just the GitHub. They go in and they just write in the JSON and they commit it themselves because our designers are awesome. And it involves things like Torque, our internal frameworks, Playground, and component examples, a little bit like React Storybook, but built into our site. And originally, we had a small style guide that was built by a hybrid, but it became a bit of a bottleneck because it was prototype code and nobody could really understand it. I mean, they had like variables like cat and dog, I don't know. And it wasn't showing the real components, so people would just inspect the source and we would end up with more fragmentation. And those things wouldn't be connected into DNA, which means they would get out of date, and they might not be necessarily correct for the use case. So we rewrote the site. And the first time we did this around was pretty quick. I was the only one on it, and then we had 2 more people added to the team that went straight onto that. We started by having a pretty standard setup with like a JSON structure, so you describe the page. So like a header text, header text, like a headline, et cetera, subtitle, like actually describing the page and inserting that into a template. But what happened was it didn't really scale. We had to create new templates for each page, and we had to maintain them. And there was a lot of kind of duplication, which is what we're trying to avoid. So I said, no, we're not doing this anymore. And I took about a sprint to do a complete re-architecture. I designed a new system where we essentially componentize all of our content into what I call content types. So componentizing, it's pretty meta. And it's testable via JSON schema validation, which I haven't actually done yet, but it will. And it's consistent and context independent. So each of our little handlebars templates can now be rendered inside of each other in any place without having errors. And again, it could be delivered by API more easily. So this will be great when we have a CMS. Demo time. Well, I'm just going to show you real quick what our actual content type looks like. So when I was doing this content type refactor, we started with some general rules that sort of evolved. And the overall philosophy is that it's a declarative approach. We're describing what the page we want to look like. Container types. The main rule is that they include a content key that is an array. So types that include other types always follow this structure. And all types have a modifier key for adding CSS classes to them, so it becomes a little bit more flexible. And all types are an object with a type key. And types are camel-cased and dash-cased. So essentially, all information should be passed in via this content variable. So we're taking the upper level and passing it in as a lower level. So this makes it so we can infinitely nest things and render things in any context, because the content variable is on every different template. So it's a little bit clever, but this is what makes it work. And it's handlebars syntax, so don't worry if you don't know that. But the philosophy still remains to be any site. So I went and I documented all these things. So now, I mean, these are really, really basic content, but sections, rows, columns, wrappers. So this is like literally the page itself. So we use these to write our JSON. Cool. And I'm just going to go over here to our actual website. So this is the first anybody's seen it outside of Adobe, so congratulations, you guys are special. We just actually launched this right before Christmas, I think. So it's our website. And we have our taxonomy here, so our guidelines up here, our styles, our elements, and patterns when we finish those, and resources and support. And our lovely designer made these little illustrations. They're great. But these are our principles again, and our platforms, some accessibility information, and our inclusion criteria, which we will get into a little bit later. This is how an egg becomes a chicken, I guess. And then our styles, things like color. So we have this little playground here, and you can click on these and copy and switch to static colors, our themes. It's pretty snazzy. And then we have a bunch of guidelines down here. So our grayscale is, it's actually generated for each color theme. So you can always depend on a certain type of gray having the correct contrast ratio based on the color theme you're using, which is awesome because accessibility. And then we use semantic colors that have meanings attached to them. A lot down here. I'm going to skip over most of this. But yeah, it's pretty comprehensive. And on our elements page, we also have a playground type situation, and our color theme persists as well, which is helpful. And we can change the platform, and iOS gets bigger because the touch target is bigger. And we link to the actual framework implementations, which is what the developers mostly use. These are all interactive here. And our usage guidelines, which is really great content that there's a lot of. So we surface that pretty, it's well organized. Just hope that everybody reads it. And then we also indicate our keyboard interaction design. So for each component, we actually make a spec of how this should be coded and what each key should do. So we actually design the accessibility for that as well. And this is our DNA. This is what I was talking about, the little variable bits. So we have semantics and elements that apply those semantics. So let's go to our button. Lots of buttons. And it's just basic JavaScript that uses all of the variables that we defined earlier, so we give it a semantic layer. So in the actual code base, they can call the button color instead of the actual color, so then we know what we're actually changing when we change those colors and all of that detail. And here's our Spectrum CSS framework. So this is what we use on the site and what all the frameworks also use. So this is what React Spectrum uses as well. Those have code samples as well. And our React Spectrum framework has a React storybook with all of its documentation here, which is super awesome as well. And it's all interactive. Great. Yay, demo. So let's talk a little bit about some of the processes that we got into as we were starting to scale this. The first thing that really was super important was getting a great support plan. So like there's 200 designers and who knows how many developers using this product. We need to support them as well as we can. They're going to have questions. They're going to have concerns. We do that via a Slack channel where designers and developers can ask questions and post examples of what they're working on to get critiques as well. Are they using Spectrum correctly? And we have office hours 3 times a week. Our Seattle designer runs those, and she's awesome. And we have bi-weekly meetings with the UI frameworks team, because if we're not actually writing the code, it's kind of easy to become, armchair designers and developers where we're not really in tune with the problems that we're solving. So we get in and we communicate with them as soon as possible. We attend each other's sprint planning, so we have Spectrum CSS representatives in our sprint planning, so they know what we're working on and what's coming up for them. And we also do quarterly hackathons to help keep everything up to date and roadmap and do all the crazy stuff that is involved with design systems at scale. So we release bi-weekly. Our release is essentially a snapshot of the design system at that time. So our UI files, our DNA. We don't actually archive the website, so the website is actually always up to date. We may start doing that later, I'm not sure. It's still super new. And we have a script that updates the what's new page on the site. It takes a couple of bullets and makes the template and releases that. And then notifies everybody in the Spectrum Bulletin Slack room. So to talk about what we're doing next and to figure out how to prioritize things, we do a lot of user testing. And our users are actually the designers and developers that use the system. So we survey them every so often. And we also do some quantitative testing, which I'll talk about later. And we prioritize based on that. But really, we're focusing on outcomes over features. So we want our definition of success to be, being useful and being a broadly distributed design excellence at Adobe. So we're adding to the top line and the bottom line. We're saving people's time, and we're also making our design better. And users like that. So there's a lot of factors and a lot of moving parts that go into having a successful design system at scale, obviously. And one of the things that we're working on now is measuring success. It's really hard, and not a lot of people have figured this out yet. But we've started implementing this thing called Spectrum Scorecard, and it's actually inspired by Google. They have Materials Scorecard. And we're making quantitative views of our adoption. So we're going to roll this up into a dashboard eventually, but right now it's just about understanding the meaningful indicators of adoption. And we score each product on different parts of our design system and how well they're utilizing them. And if they're not really doing so well, we don't give them a ton of support. We say, here's your path forward, go there. And then once you're at a state where we can really help, we're all for it. So this is great for our execs as well, because we actually have numerical quantitative views of where we are and how much we've accomplished. So the scorecard process starts with a 5-question pre-scorecard assessment. Essentially, it's just, are you even using Spectrum? If you're not, go back and start adopting it, please. We're really useful, thank you. And the product sends us 5 or so screens that they want us to evaluate that are representative of their product as a whole. For each screen, we ask questions that can be answered yes or no. And we average out those scores in several topics and then a bottom line score. So they may be doing really well in our colors, they may be doing really well in our fonts, and right now it's pretty visual, and we want to get a little bit better about things like patterns, which we haven't really done a ton of development on yet. And the post-scorecard self-assessment is the important part for us. That's how well did we do for them. And scorecards can sound a little bit like policing, like compliance, but it's really about understanding how good of a job are we doing meeting the needs of these products. Like, are we even doing our job well? They're probably not using it for a good reason. And we want to find out what that is and find out how we can improve. And this is also our most important benchmark. This is what we want to be able to present to executives, be like, hey, this is how we were, this is how we are in Q4, this is where we've come, and this is all the product needs that we're meeting now. So the last piece of the design system is actually what I work on. This is called precursors. Last couple months we've been spinning this up. But what happened when we ate Coral and we got that top-down verdict that Spectrum design is king and everything is Spectrum now, was Coral had a lot of components. You might have noticed that we don't actually have that many yet. We're building them out. But they had a lot. And we kind of realized that some of that was very specific to the Marketing Cloud and didn't work across all of Adobe, which is what we really needed. So we kind of like took it back. And that kind of pisses off a lot of people, but it's necessary. So what we've done in the meantime is create a second level of the design system, which is more of like a beta layer, an incubator or whatnot. And it's called Precursors. It's a web app that allows users to upload examples of their designs and allows us to post our beta designs. Things that maybe were in Coral but aren't in Spectrum that people still need to use. And it promotes transparency in the org so everybody can see what everybody else is doing. And hopefully we, by this, by osmosis, get less duplication because there's only so many setting screens that you could look at and create a different one. And we approve or deny these designs if they're going to go on the Precursors website, and the contribution process begins. So we start checking off inclusion criteria and putting things through the process to become Spectrum. And this allows us to solve more problems faster as well. The future. So in 2018, we want to incentivize this contribution model via providing a spot bonus. We love paying people. And hopefully that will get more, because it's a lot of work to get things from beta to Spectrum. So we want to incentivize that as much as possible. We're going to work more on tooling, add more components, really ramp up our scorecard and start evaluating more products and testing them. And hopefully writing some tooling to actually support that so we can make it less manual, so we can just feed it a website or a mock and just like get a view of how many colors they're using and all that stuff automated. Hopefully we'll go open source soon so our third-party developers can help this. And I just want to end with this one quote that I love ending with, but it's actually not about design systems at all, but it's been driving my thoughts about it. Basically, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. So our job is really to do things well, document them well, and if we do document them well, we have to explain and teach it and demonstrate it, and then people will be excited. And it's not about our Spectrum website, which is beautiful, and I love it, but more about the Spectrum design system itself. We'll make ourselves look useful, we'll make ourselves look great, and people will start using it, and then we will get our goals done. So, thank you so much.